Great. Looks like we've got a good group here so far. So I'm going to dive in so that we get the most of our host's time. So thanks everyone for joining today as we talk about the American Jobs Plan and how the local government is impacted by this proposal. So to introduce myself, my name is Teresa Hebert and I am the Senior Communications Manager at Quorum. I'm joined by Eve Maldonado O'Toole and Leslie Polner, who co-lead Holland and Knight's local government group. Thank you so much, Eve and Leslie, for joining us today. So first, before we dive into the in-depth parts of the proposal, I want to look at the dialogue that we're seeing in Congress on issues facing local governments. So first, housing is a big factor in this proposal. We've seen a couple spikes already this year on the topic of housing, both with the passage of the Equality Act that prohibits discrimination in housing based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and with the American Rescue Plan passed earlier in March. And now the American Jobs Plan presents a third wave of conversation around housing. And then in broadband, we've seen that the American Jobs Plan brought a steady upward trend of conversations around broadband, with a spike just in the last week or so with the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. Much of the housing dialogue right now is being dominated by Democrats, but broadband dialogue is a little more evenly split, given that there are more Democrats in Congress than Republicans. But to dive right in, Leslie and Eve, can you tell us a little bit about what aspects of this American Jobs Plan from President Biden are most relevant for folks in the local government?
Well, thanks, Teresa. So look, the American Jobs Plan is one of the most comprehensive plans that has been introduced, $2.3 trillion, really touching virtually every issue that local governments care about, ranging from traditional transportation, roads, bridges, to less traditional, housing, broadband, workforce, climate, water, school construction, higher ed construction, the electric grid, childcare, $50 billion investment to improve infrastructure resilience. So really just across the gamut right now, touching local government needs. In addition to some of the less traditional elements of sort of what we'd call hard infrastructure, the plan also includes some of the things that would be more, kind of social infrastructure related. And so that would be things like investments around a $400 billion investment towards expanding access to quality, affordable home or community-based elder care. So the plan is comprehensive. I think one of the pieces to remind everyone is, of course, the American Jobs Plan is just that. It was a plan. It's not legislative text. So it's really, really broad outlines. And as Eve and I will talk about, there's the play that's happening through the administration's proposals. And then, of course, there's work being done on the Hill and in Congress to try to drive some of these pieces home.
Great. And so the first topic we are going to cover is housing. What is in the American Jobs Plan for housing, and where are discussions on the Hill for those housing provisions?
Thanks, Teresa. In terms of the American Jobs Plan, it includes $213 billion for housing, and that is including $40 billion to make repairs to public housing. There's resources in there to support home ownership and weatherized homes. It also calls on Congress to enact a program that awards flexible funding to jurisdictions that take steps to eliminate exclusionary zoning and land use policies. One thing that it does not include is an expansion of vouchers, which many state and local elected officials and stakeholders are calling for as part of this infrastructure plan. But the president's FY 2022 proposed budget request, that is the framework that came out, does include funds for 200,000 new vouchers. In terms of what's happening on the Hill, as Leslie indicated, now with the president's plan that provides the framework, it's now the committees to do the work to figure out what is within the framework in terms of existing programs or new programs that they're focused on. As I mentioned, there is a major push for scaling up the expansion of vouchers to all eligible households. There's also a major push for increased funding for the National Trust Fund. as well as expanding and strengthening the low-income housing tax credit. There's already been legislation introduced, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, S 1136 and HR 2573, which another focus for legislative activity. And then another focus has been on creating a housing stabilization fund. That is funds to, help folks on the front end that are teetering on homelessness, that, may suffer a, health emergency or job loss. So those are some of the major conversations around housing that are happening on the Hill.
Great. And so next, wanted to dive into broadband. Where does the administration sit in their proposal? And then what are the discussions like in Congress for broadband?
Well, broadband's really interesting because, Teresa, as you noted earlier, there is really bipartisan support for expansion of broadband. And certainly the pandemic has brought home to everyone that, broadband is really an essential service. So the American Job Plan proposes $100 billion to increase broadband infrastructure to reach 100% high-speed coverage throughout the United States. Included in that is also efforts around digital equity, digital literacy. So making sure that, not only do you have the infrastructure, but do you know how to access it? Do you know how to use it? It prioritizes support for broadband networks that would be owned, operated, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, or cooperatives. And so, really contemplates taking out any state bans on those types of ownership arrangements, and then really starts to think about trying to have greater price transparency and competition among internet providers. The American Jobs Plan really aligns with proposals that have already been on the Hill. It really is incorporating a lot of work that was already happening. And so one of those major pieces of legislation is the LIFT Act, which House Democrats from the Energy and Commerce Committee introduced in the 116th Congress. They have now reintroduced and just did a hearing on it in March. And so, very similar, proposes, $80 billion for broadband deployment to unserved and underserved areas, $625 million for a grant program to address barriers to broadband adoption, and then another $625 million to create a competitive grant program to help address any barriers to adoption. $6 billion in additional funding for the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program that the FCC has just created, and then $2 billion for the Emergency Connectivity Fund to support distance learning and access for K-12. So, and also Energy and Commerce similarly is very concerned about state bans that would prohibit local governments or public-private partnerships and cooperatives from delivering competitive broadband service. So again, you're seeing AJP aligned closely with congressional efforts already. And I will say this, that as these infrastructure conversations are happening between Congress and the administration, I think broadband is one of those pieces that could certainly make it into a bipartisan infrastructure package, given the level of support right now.
Right, and you spoke about some of the bipartisanship, and something I noticed in a lot of the dialogue we were looking at is that Republicans are using the phrase a lot, broadband is traditional infrastructure. In their debate over what infrastructure, what the definition of it is, they're being really conscious of, like, we believe broadband is included in that, along with roads, bridges, things that are more traditional.
Which is fascinating too, because of course, 10 years ago, if we had been having this conversation, there is no way that that kind of language would have been used. So.
Yeah, exactly. Great. So next, I want to talk about transportation. What are the transportation provisions in the American Jobs Plan, and how does this play out in Congress with the current movement of the surface transportation reauthorization discussions?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. In terms of the American Jobs Plan, it proposes $85 billion to modernize existing transit. It proposes $621 billion for bridges, roads, and highways, including, which is something that's, I know, important to local governments, a new Safe Streets for All program to fund state and local Vision Zero plans to reduce crashes and fatalities. It proposes $25 billion for airports, and then another 17 billion for inland waterways, coastal ports, lands, ports of entry, and ferries. And this also includes a healthy ports program to mitigate the cumulative impacts of air pollution on neighborhoods near ports, often that are communities of color. It also proposes 80 billion for rail, and it also includes 174 billion investment in electrical vehicle infrastructure, which includes establishing a grant and incentive program for both the public and private sector to build a national network of 500,000 EV chargers by 2030. It also establishes a new clean buses for kids program in order to electrify at least 20% of the school bus fleet. In terms of what's happening, on the Hill, we've seen a couple of counter offers now from the Republicans. So Senator Capito, who is the ranking member of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, released a 568 billion infrastructure framework as a counter offer to the American Jobs Plan. And that proposal focuses mainly on kind of traditional physical infrastructure like roads, bridges, water, broadband, airports, rail, and transit. But obviously there is a very big gap between the 2 trillion American Jobs Plan and a 568 billion bill. But they are working hard to see if there is some kind of bipartisan compromise that can be agreed to, that they could move forward with. And you've probably seen in the press, the president, inviting, several Republican, senators to have discussions on this. And so those discussions continue to occur. Yesterday, House Republicans led by the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee ranking member, Sam Graves, they unveiled their own take on how to fund bridges, roads, and transit with a 400 billion plan. Notably, that plan does not include climate provisions or passenger rail, which are top priorities for the Democrats. In terms of timing for surface transportation reauthorization, both committees had indicated that they were going to move something by the Memorial Day recess. That is the Senate Environment and Public Works and House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. The House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee timing has been delayed. They're now looking at June, but Senate Environment and Public Works Committee is still saying that they're planning on marking up next week. So that's where things stand.
Great. And our next issue we want to talk about is workforce development. What kind of funding does the American Jobs Plan cover for workforce development?
So workforce development is really interesting because it has definitely been one of the glaring missing items from all of the COVID relief packages that we've had so far. And, quite frankly, of course, those were really designed to staunch the emergency that we were having. The American Jobs Plan, I think, rightly recognizes that workforce development is really a core part of recovery. You've seen a lot of shifts in the labor market. There's been a lot of displacement. And so President Biden proposes $100 billion for workforce investment, which would include $40 billion for a new dislocated worker program and sector-based training. There's also a proposal for $12 billion for clean energy, manufacturing, and infrastructure jobs, with a particular focus to make sure that those jobs are accessible to women and individuals of color. There's a $48 billion investment in apprenticeships, pre-apprenticeships, and then supporting community college partnerships, as well as trying to do career pathways in STEM. And then there are some, regulatory proposals as well that would be tied to project labor, community workforce, and local hire. And just as a side note, yesterday you saw Secretary Buttigieg announce a new local hire pilot program. So beginning to try to move on some of these, even without legislation. What you're really seeing on the Hill is, a number of pieces of legislation that are being introduced or reintroduced that reflect President Biden's vision. Chairman Bobby Scott from the House Education and Labor Committee and Senate Help Committee Chairwoman Patty Murray reintroduced their Relaunching America's Workforce Act. That contemplates significant workforce development investment aligned with what President Biden has proposed at a lower level, at a $15 billion level. I don't think you could easily see in negotiations that number coming up because it has been a priority for Democrats. But so, you've also seen Chairman Scott and Chairwoman Murray introduce the Child Care for Working Families Act, so making significant investments not only in childcare infrastructure, but also in childcare workforce. So you're really seeing kind of pieces, elements of the plan getting introduced as standalone legislation, and then members are working to build support for those pieces in the hopes that they'll be folded into a larger proposal.
Great. So our next talk about we've talked about some of the key players and some of these individual issues. Who are the main players that you all are looking at when looking at the American Jobs Plan as a whole?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, the, kind of big four House and Senate leadership, right? So, Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader, Schumer, Minority Leader McConnell, Minority Leader McCarthy. And then, really key are the Senate moderates. That is, like Senators Manchin, Sinema, Collins, Murkowski, Capito. And then for example, as I talked about housing earlier, so, the committees of jurisdiction. So for housing, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and then on the Senate side, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Toomey. And then, of course, for transportation, Chairman Carper, you have Ranking Member Capito, and then on the House side, Chairman DeFazio and Ranking Member Graves. And Leslie, I don't know if you want to add some to some of the other issues that you talked about.
No, I mean, I think, certainly just as you think about committees of jurisdiction, obviously Senate Commerce, the broadband issues, Senate Commerce, so Senator Cantwell, House Energy and Commerce would be, Chairman Pallone. So a number of folks too. I mean, it is so expansive that you're really touching a number of issues. There's almost no committee that isn't going to touch some aspect of this plan.
And I would also add too is, even if you have, members that are not, part of the leadership or, committee leadership, I mean, working with your members to weigh in with, House and Senate leaders and committee leaders is incredibly important as these discussions advance.
And so we've talked a lot about the issues that are impacting local governments. Now, what should those local governments be doing to have an influence on the issues?
Well, I think as Eve just mentioned, I mean, I think certainly, now is the time to weigh in with your local representative and your senators, particularly on the areas that are priorities. It's helpful for them to hear. And I would say, especially if there are going to be items that would not be considered quote unquote traditional infrastructure. I do think that it's important for them to hear about these other priority areas, whether that's childcare or elder care. I think it's helpful for them to hear that. I would also just say too, a number of local governments are part of broader associations or have relationships with communities in their state. I think it's really helpful to try to speak collectively on these issues as well. And so whether it's particular aspects of the transportation bill that are incredibly important, I think that's very helpful too.
And
yeah, sorry, Eve, go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna add too and underscore everything that Leslie said. I would also to Leslie's point, I think advocate often, right? Because for example, on housing, a number of folks hadn't thought about housing as infrastructure, and so I would underscore advocating often. Also highlighting programs that are working on the local level. I think that's important as well to show the success stories, whether that is through social media or even op-eds where maybe you pair local leader, elected official with, a business CEO and do an op-ed. I'd also, say too that, it's not just, the infrastructure bill, but also looking at the annual appropriations bill. And, urging, for example, if we're talking about transportation and housing, for the strongest possible top line HUD appropriations number.
And I was going to add on to Leslie's comment about that coalition building, because when we talk to corporations, trade associations, they have expansive footprints in lots of districts, but a local government by nature only has one, or maybe a small, if you cross multiple congressional districts, a small handful of folks who represent you. And so building those coalitions of other communities to engage with other legislators is important in this case.
I think that's exactly right, Teresa. I mean, I think the other piece is right. It helps expand your reach. So perhaps, either perhaps your member is already solid on your issue or is hopeless on your issue, right? When you're working in coalition, it helps expand your reach so that you're able to target additional people to weigh in on your priorities.
And to your point, Teresa, just as a for example, I mean, it's also, looking at, if you're, building something and need to show the importance of, a particular program that would support the construction of X, Y, Z, right? But looking at the supply chain, right? Which, I'm sure touches, districts and jurisdictions from across the country.
Right, so still finding those footprints, but getting a little more creative about maybe about the ways that you connect to other people's districts.
Exactly.
Great. We are now going to turn over to questions from the audience. So folks who are joining us today, feel free to use the Q&A box on your Zoom screen to send questions in, and we'll pass those along to Eve and Leslie. We do have one to get started, a question about the workforce development conversation we had, and whether funding a public health workforce would be something that's included in this, or is that only coming from funds in the American Rescue Plan?
That's a great question. So the American Rescue Plan obviously has very targeted public workforce funds. It's actually kind of one of the few areas of workforce funding that any of the COVID relief packages included. The American Jobs Plan, I think public workforce would certainly be eligible. It less calls that out specifically. So many of these programs would certainly benefit public health workforce programs, but they are not targeted as specifically as they are in the American Rescue Plan.
Great. And a similar question that I had coming from the workforce development conversation, we talked a little bit about equity and targeting some of those programs at women and people of color. Can you talk about some of the ways equity is coming into these other conversations in transportation and broadband, and how that's a driving force in this bill, in this proposal?
I mean, I think, and Eve, please jump in on this as well. I mean, it's a huge priority for this administration and frankly for the Democratic majority in Congress. I think there is a widespread recognition that equity needs to be front and center. And so the way that you're seeing this is, whether from the administration in grant opportunities, they're explicitly calling out equity as a criteria that they want applicants to discuss and really be very intentional about how a project addresses equity issues. And so that is really front and center for the administration. I think in Congress, you're really seeing legislative proposals that are very explicitly addressing equity issues, targeting equity issues. It is really, frankly, in my opinion, a sea change from where we were a year ago or 2 years ago. It is really a whole new vocabulary, frankly, that local governments need to be using in their conversations with Congress. But Eve, please jump in.
No, I agree. I would say equity and climate, because both of them seem to underpin a lot of the focus of what the administration has proposed and will continue to propose, as well as what Congress is looking at.
And jumping off of that, so a conversation we've had in some of our other sessions over the past 2 weeks as part of this series is we've talked a lot about how there are these moderate Republicans that need to be swayed to sign on to a proposal, but which are the things that, on the other hand, the more progressive Democrats are going to stick their foot in the ground for, whether it's climate? Are there things you see fitting into that category in the social infrastructure world where have to be watching those progressive Democrats and which things they are going to require as mandatory for their support?
Certainly, I think climate is going to be a big one. I mean, I think if there is not significant investment in resiliency and climate, whether that's at energy, at transportation, right across the spectrum, I think progressives will be very concerned.
And we saw that too in housing with the recent introduction of, a housing plan by the progressives.
From a strategy perspective, how do you all recommend or differences between some of the major cities? So the local government of a major city is obviously very different than a smaller, more rural area. What kind of different advice do you give for folks who have that different level of potential experience in this kind of engagement?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, there's, to be honest, right, they're both really, really important. I think no matter what happens, whether you're a large urban area or you're a rural community, the important piece is knowing what your priorities are and making sure that your member knows what your priorities are, right? Even for a large urban area, and sometimes that gets very challenging, right? To be able to narrow not to your top 20, but really to your top 3, because it can get very overwhelming for members and for senators to try to address all of those. And that same advice goes for rural communities as well.
And I would just say, again, showing how a program works at the local level, whether it's rural, suburban, or urban, I think is, really important.
Yeah, I think that prioritization is really interesting, that this is such a wide bill that if you try and dip your toes in every single issue, you're going to be spread pretty thin. Great. It doesn't look like we have other questions coming in. So is there anything else that we have not touched on that you all think is important for folks who care about these issues to know about before we sign off? Oh, I spoke too soon. We maybe got one last one in. A question that we got in right as I was jumping the gun: how do you see affordable housing within infrastructure with workable production with awareness?
I think, I applaud, right, the administration for including housing as part of their infrastructure plan. The infrastructure plan that was passed by the House previously included housing as well. So I think the expectation is that there will be some strong, affordable, housing provisions that are part of the plan. I think, the question is, what the details look like, particularly, around the voucher piece, and whether or not, the focus will be to just focus that conversation around appropriations and try to scale it up there, and or, really trying to make a big push for, voucher expansion, as part of this infrastructure, plan.
Great. Now I think those are all our questions. Anything else that you all think is important to know before we sign off?
No, I think just both Leslie and I would just say, get in there and make your priorities known. This is the time. This will be, one-time funding. And, they're looking at, pushing a lot through existing programs, but there's also the opportunity, to be creative and look at some new programs.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know I've learned a lot about this issue, and so thank you again.
Thanks, Teresa.
Thank you.
All right, have a great afternoon.